So on the agenda tonight, we have an update and discussion of coronavirus relief funds, followed by implications for the budget after coronavirus relief funds end. And then we have a discussion about elementary reconfiguration for consideration in FY22. So I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Miranda and Javier.
Okay,
Miranda,
I will.
Covering this, right?
Yep, I'll share my screen if you let me.
Okay, let's figure this out. You got it.
Okay. Everybody see it?
Yep.
Okay. So we just kind of wanted to start sort of, I mean, it's really a recap of stuff we've seen before, but the numbers have been updated and some things have changed both since our last Finance Committee meeting and since the similar presentation at the last, not the last board meeting, but the one before. And so it's really all similar content with just revised figures, just to bring you guys back up to speed with the latest. So as the chair mentioned, this is our agenda. So start with an update on kind of our coronavirus relief funds budget, and then really focus on the implications after coronavirus relief funds end, and then kind of shift gears and talk a little bit about elementary reconfiguration, potentially for FY22. All right, so back to just kind of coronavirus relief funds budget. We have a $6.2 million allocation, and these are the very broad categories where we've distributed that funding. Not too much just changed here. The basic categories remain the same, but some of the amounts have shifted around, and I think the big thing is that we've shifted the childcare costs out with the news that the state was going to fund that in a separate pool of funds. So technology, I think it might be exactly the same as you've seen in the past, about 2.7 million, and that's one-to-one devices, staff device refresh, and some software and tech support. Human resources staffing, that's gone up, as you probably noticed in the board meeting presentation. We've had to add a lot more FTEs for remote academy backfills than were in our initial application. We'll talk more about that later, but I think we had already been planning on some FTE adds for special ed, ELL, and specials. Facilities, most of that stuff has been discussed. That hasn't changed too much. We've shifted some funding around to make sure we have what we need for outdoor classrooms. But by and large, those initiatives remain the same as previously discussed. And then we did add some budget for supplies, for take-home kits, just more supplies at the school level, given that kids can't share supplies. So our supplies budget has increased, and also we've identified some areas where food services may have additional costs. So we want to try to build those in to the extent possible, especially since we may be having some challenges on the revenue side with food services. So so basically it was not hard, unfortunately. It was too easy to reallocate the money that was freed up from the childcare moving to a different pool of funding. We pretty much ate that up with our FTE ads and supplies. And I should also note that if you actually add these figures up, it's 6.45 million or so. So we actually still have some cutting back to do in this budget. And it's really just an exercise in prioritization that is still ongoing until we have final decisions, until we have the best information that we have, or until we hit the deadline, which is November 30th. So kind of want to take as much time as we can to get it as close to right as possible, because quite frankly, it's very hard to plan a $6.2 million budget to the penny and actually be able to spend it all. We get balanced budgeting enough so we're not stuck with extra costs at the end of this, but we also don't want to leave money on the table, right? So it's just trying to get the best estimates that we can and moving forward from there. So the one thing that I'll mention as well is that was on this list before that is not today is buses. with other needs surfacing, we have kind of shifted those off of this budget with the hope that we can find a different funding source to purchase buses. We had some buses budgeted in CIP. We bought one of them with FY20 funds. We weren't going to buy the other. There were 6. We bought 4. We bought 5. One of them was paid for with last year's funds. So we actually have 2, potentially more, that we can buy with CIP funds. So we're thinking about reverting back to that plan or potentially using capital reserve. So, you know, things are all in flux, but that's kind of why we chose to move the buses off of this in the hope it was something that we could find other funding sources to use to purchase them. So I guess I'll pause for a second and see if there's any questions specifically on this. And I can't see everybody, so if just let me know if there is, but otherwise I'll move on.
I do have a quick question. It's Mark.
Okay.
Yeah, just, you know, doing a rough addition. I'm getting 6.4. Is it supposed to be 6.4 million? Is that what you said? I thought I heard 6.2.
If the allocation is 6.2, this adds up to 6.4 because we still have to shave some off of this.
Okay, that's what you're saying. Gotcha.
Yep.
Gotcha.
Yep.
All right. Thank you.
And I did submit an initial application. Our initial application was 6.2, but since then I've been kind of compiling all the requests and asks into the same place, and this is sort of where I've landed. And we have to, you know, discuss as a team and prioritize to get down to that 6.2 figure. But I'm pretty confident we'll be okay. I got to tighten up some estimates as well, and then we'll be able to make the kind of final decision to get down to the 6.2.
Cool. Now I'm following. Thank you.
Yeah. Good to move on. So this just, I already noted this, but just wanted to make sure it was clear to everybody that the childcare, you know, budget wasn't cut from that. It was just moved to a different funding source that the state has shared. So we submitted an application. Unfortunately, this pool of funds is, there's a lot of restrictions on it. It's a bit difficult to navigate. It's also a competitive grant application as opposed to the other one, which was an allocation. So we were entitled to 6.2 million. In this case, we're not entitled to anything per se. We have to submit a competitive application. We submitted it last week. It was a quick turnaround. We had some questions, making some revisions, trying to figure out the best way forward. I mean, I think eventually we'll get I think we'll be able to get an approvable application in. It's just, it's a tricky one, so we're still in the application process. But the budget that was submitted is about 1.1 million, and that's where we're hoping it will land. I see a question.
So on, yes, thank you. Sorry about that. So are we? So we're not assured the childcare funding, but we feel confident that we'll get close to that amount.
We're not assured.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, please.
We're not assured it, but we will know that whether or not we have it and in how much and in what amount before we have to finalize our other application. So it would be very unfortunate if we didn't get it and we had to bump $1 million off of our other CRF, but we will have that information before we have to make that final decision. So if that is the case, we'll address it. But I'm hopeful, you know, the state has 25 million allocated to this. We're the biggest district. I'm hopeful that, you know, we'll be able to make it work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Did I see a hand from Mr. Atkinson as well? Or was...
Yeah, Tim has his hand raised.
Okay.
Thank you. I was curious if the same December 31st deadline applies to this fund as well.
It does, unfortunately.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so you've seen this slide before, but it's just basically making the key points. And, you know, I do think, you know, obviously we could spend more, but I think by and large, the coronavirus relief funds all told meet our most critical needs. And the real challenge is, you know, proceeding without, you know, having funding sources identified to keep us going past December 31st. So the costs for services to continue as they are currently planned for this fall, to have them continue beyond December 30th. The costs are significant and the funding sources at this point are limited. So just, that's basically the key. The key in terms of what our financial challenges are. And so this is basically a revised slide similar to what you saw at the board meeting that shows the financial implications of the FTEs, specifically the positions that we're proposing to add for the fall. So it's slightly different, but hopefully a little bit clearer. And this is the latest that we have. So it is not the same number of FTEs as you saw on Tuesday, a week and a half ago Tuesday. It's 54.4 FTEs now. Last time it was 46.9, so 7.5 more FTEs than you thought, or than we thought. The good news is that it's 4.5 more ed techs, and I might be getting my numbers wrong and I can't see my notes, but I think it's 4.5 ed techs. So of the ads, there's more ed techs than teachers, so it didn't add as much as it would have if it was all teachers. But so the numbers that you're seeing are also somewhat redistributed. So we have more backfills, but we have fewer ads, mainly because we were counting some as ads that proved really to be backfill. So there's been some redistribution of the figures, but the net increase is 7.5. So let's just go through this. We've got almost 29 remote academy teacher backfills and 6.5 ed tech backfills. And so for the CRF budget, that's about 600,000 and some change. But for after that, you can see it's, almost $1.5 million in continuation costs. And then for scheduling additions, specific ads for specials, ELL, and special ed, we have the list below, which accounts for the rest of the difference. I don't need to go through every single figure. The key takeaway is that, it's $1 million or so in our CRF budget, but it's 2.1, almost $2.2 million to continue this after December 30th. That should say 30th. So it's substantial, obviously. And there's a question from Tim.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I'd like a little bit more sort of explanation on the backfills and sort of why it's necessary to add so many FTEs to backfill. And my other question is, we are hiring on these positions as full year position. Is that correct? And does that mean that we're basically committed to that 2.14 million for the back half of the year, despite whatever sort of may come in terms of additional funds that could come in to support that, or I guess we're foreseeing that that is not likely or not something we can assume. So I just want to sort of understand. I guess I think I've asked my questions.
Yeah. So do you want me to talk about the backfills, Miranda? Or
If you'd like, I mean, I could try. You might be able to describe it more clearly.
Hardly, but I'll try. So the primary reason for the backfills is that we had to move X number of positions to create the classrooms in the remote academy. And obviously some of, we have altogether, I think 70 positions in the remote academy. Is that right, Miranda?
Yep, I think that's right. Last I knew.
So, some of those positions, you can see we're not backfilling 70 positions. So this is just the, sort of the elementary reconfiguration math, back at play here. that you've got, these positions that have been created over there. There's been some reduction in FTE at the school level, but not enough it's not a one-to-one flip. And so that's the basic math around why the bulk of those positions, so the 35 that are tied up into the remote academy. The others are a combination of remote academy additional positions that we had to do for ELL and special ed and things along those lines, as well as just some additional specials that we already knew, and those were like you saw those all the way back, earlier in this process, where we were adding that in order to be able to give teachers a full planning period during the school day so that they could switch over and check in with their remote students who, so the other half of their class that is remote during those days. So that's the FTE that was needed to do that, and to also reduce the exposure of our specials teachers that would go with, sort of seeing all 300 kids or all, 250 kids in any one day. So I think that's the essence of, all of those FTE increases. So that's the first half of your question. The other one in terms
Follow up on the first half. Is that
yeah.
heavy? I just want to make sure I sort of fully understand it. So we're essentially sort of losing some efficiency, or maybe another way to say that is class sizes are probably smaller in a lot of cases. Is that understanding it correctly? Because no.
I wish it were, but it's not. So some of the remote academy classes are up to 26 students and things along those lines. So, it's just basically that you're subtracting X number of students, but you're not subtracting, X number of classes from a school. So there might have been, 6 kindergartners, 3 3 first grade students, 8 second grade students, and that does not is not enough of a reduction to sort of have a section pulled out. But in some cases, there is a section pulled out, and those numbers might be very close to the threshold of closer to the threshold.
Great, thank you.
Do you want me to answer the second part?
Please do. Yeah.
I mean, I guess the answer to the second part, I think, it's not, it remains to be seen, but I mean, we're not committed. We have the ability to, I think it's 90 days notice to eliminate positions, right? Is that right, Javier? I mean, I think it's 90-day notice.
Correct.
And to the extent we end up in a different situation come, later in the fall, we're not obligated to keep these positions or any other positions for the remainder of the year. So, we will have to make decisions to the extent we're not able to fund these. If these continue to be necessary and we don't have the funds, then we'll have to find somewhere else to cut. But in terms of being committed, beyond the 90-day period, we are not committed per se to these or any other position. Would you agree with that assessment, Javier? I mean, I
Absolutely.
don't know what else to say about that other than there's probably going to be some hard decisions, but depending on what happens, we may, and I'm getting into the funding sources on the next slide. So anyone that has a question about that, we can discuss then, but we might be able to, we're not $2 million short. We have some funding sources identified. We're more like, $600,000 or $800,000 short, which is shorter than we were going to be a week ago and shorter than we were at 3 p.m. the day of the board meeting. So, the numbers have been shifting, but we're a fair amount of the way there. And, depending on how things play out, we could have some, we could have some savings to reallocate to this.
Thank you both.
Mm-hmm.
Emily?
I think that answers my question, but just to play it out a little bit, say we're in a scenario where where we do well, reopening schools in terms of not seeing a big increase in cases. And there's more interest. I know we've asked families to commit to the semester, but that there's interest from among more families to be in person, you know, at their first opportunity. But we have, you know, a 90-day obligation to our staff. Would we, for the, in the kind of transition period, would we reassign staff to just make the most out of the fact that we continue to have, at that point, you know, perhaps more staff than we otherwise would have in our schools in person? Again, just like playing out the scenario of like 3 months actually is in the middle of, you know, perhaps a pandemic where the outcomes aren't changing as nearly as fast as I and everyone else want. It's, you know, it still feels like a long period of time.
They would still be our employees. You know, obviously an employee that is about to get laid off is not you know, is not always the most reliable employee, but they would still be our employees, and we could redeploy them, you know, for the full, you know, for that time within their, you know, within the bounds of their qualification, certification, and things along those lines.
And do we consider just hiring them for, you know, for this initial semester, and then, or we didn't have that flexibility?
We didn't feel that we could get people if we just offered them, you know, a temporary employment. So we did 1 year only, so that we knew that we would only be committed to them for a year. And, you know, we had to do that too, because we have people that are on leaves that they're filling in for and things along those lines. So that's, you know, part of this whole number. And so, you know, we did 1 year only because some people are going to come back into those roles. And also because we knew that, you know, this was this year and what we needed to do to be able to operationalize school for this year. But, you know, but we did not feel that if we offered a, you know, a job through December 31st, and, you know, so.
I would also add, and this was hard for me to accept at first as well, but I think that, and I can't remember who made this case, but I mean, the only way we don't need them to continue is if we know and make a decision for the rest of the year that we're not coming back, you know? So if once they're gone, if they're long-term subs for 2 or 3 months, we have no option to go back and forth, you know, if we close, you know, it's just, so how do you not do it for the year? You know, of course, if we find ourselves in a situation where we literally can't afford it, we have to make decisions. But, you know, at this moment, it seemed like the only practical way forward, adding, you know, on top of the fact that, you know, we're just not gonna be able to hire 50 FTEs for, you know, 2 months or as temp employees, like Javier said. So I think that played into it as well.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Anna's hand is up.
Yeah, I actually had a couple of questions. One, Javier, you had mentioned that the class sizes for the remote academy in some cases are quite high. I was wondering if there's like, you know, research or thought about best practices around class sizes, particularly for remote classes. Is it easier to have more students in a remote setting, or what's the kind of thinking about that?
I don't know anything about the actual research around that, you know, so I'm sorry, but I can't really speak in an educated way about it.
Okay. And then my other question was, you know, I've been thinking, or I've been reading a lot about how different institutions are kind of looking at the practices that they're adopting during coronavirus and kind of thinking about how to incorporate new ideas permanently. Has there been any thought about the remote academy on a more long-term basis at all, if it turns out to be a success?
I think if it turns out to be a success, it's something that we would look to revisiting. I think we definitely, we've talked a little bit about this before, that we definitely think that there is a lot that we've learned in terms of how to do school remotely. So from just the standpoint of snow days, for example, that's an example that I've used before, we will be, once we actually operationalize our new technology and everything else, we will be in a, very comfortable position to say, like, when we would normally have had a snow day, we will have a, remote day, and that we'll have assignments and things along those lines. So that's like one example of a practice that, sort of flows from the work that we've had to do this year that goes beyond that. And, and just like that, I think that there will be other things in terms of, like, the notion of the Portland Promise point person. We're starting to see little bits and pieces of where that role is, really emerging as somebody who's advocating for, a student in a way, sort of all the way up through the organization. And so I think that there are things, without a doubt, that will, that will come out of this, that will change us. And then, it will also, there's, some things that we are probably doing that we will do differently, that we will, go back to doing the way that we used to do them.
Okay, thank you.
Any other hands? Can't see everyone.
Not right now.
Okay. So, on top of this is not the only continuation cost, and this is also, this is not actually a completely exhaustive list, but it's the biggest areas. Additional potential costs to continue things the way we have designed them for the fall, into the next calendar year, building subs, temp coverage, and then before and after care as well. Totals another $2 million for a grand total of $4.2 million. That's the cost to continue what we're doing this fall. So it's a lot. Obviously, we're not going to have $4.2 million in the local budget. To the extent we get additional relief funds, that would be amazing. I have not heard anything about that for beyond the calendar year. So obviously, we'll have some difficult decisions to make. So I just want to make sure that this is, clear to everyone what we're looking at here. And finally, some of the funding sources. So basically, there's about $800,000 in local funds that I feel comfortable saying we have available at this point. And that does not include really any COVID-related savings, which I anticipate once we get going, we'll have more information, we'll be able to find additional COVID-related savings. So I'm not including any of that in that $800,000. The $800,000 that I'm referring to specifically is about $350 in retirements turnover that I know about, 150 for SROs at this point has not been reallocated, and 300,000. We had, those of you who were at the August Finance Committee meeting, you guys know we had a fair amount left in the budget for FY20. We were able to do some strategic grant reallocations and charge the local budget for some Title I teachers in order to save Title I carryover and be able to charge a portion of the math coaches that we budgeted in local for FY21, retain some of that on the grant for FY21. So that's going to save us about $300,000 on local. So I don't know if I don't know if I explained that in any way that makes sense, but yeah, we basically.
I'll do the graphics.
Yeah, there you go. Guess I should have just done that. Point being, we've been able to save about $300,000 on local for FY21 doing that swap. So that comes to the 800, and then we have the CARES contingency, which obviously we've been talking about the CARES contingency of about 600, 650 for quite some time, and we have it, but we don't want to spend it. But with that, slate of costs on the prior two slides, it's going to be really hard to preserve, but obviously that's going to be a goal throughout the year. But it's there and it's available. So that comes to about 1.45 million. That goes a long way towards the 2 million, especially when you consider that we may have a fair amount of COVID-related savings as we move into the year. So I'm thinking specifically, and I would love to tell you that I've been able to come to, numbers on these things. I haven't. We haven't actually started school yet. I still have some thoughts about where we can find some funds, but obvious places such as potentially travel, staff travel, potentially stipends, potentially metro, things along those lines, especially where we saw savings last year, and depending on how things play out, we may see significant savings. So, but I'm just really not in a position to say that I've got figures on that right now, but I'm optimistic we can make up some more ground that way. So finally, we've talked about this a little bit in prior meetings. We do have a capital reserve fund of about 2.5 million. To the extent there are no additional relief funds for this fall, we may even try to tap into that for some additional facilities modifications. Anything that utilizes the reserve will require a council approval. And then, we do have fund balance, about 4.5 million. I also, with looking forward into the future, I don't, necessarily recommend that we go in that route at all, but those are funds that are there. And I have gone back and forth a bit with Drummond Woodsum to try to understand exactly what the process would be, to the extent we really felt we wanted to try to appropriate more from our fund balance for use in FY21. And I'm not quite prepared to share what the details are. It'll definitely be at least a council vote. It might be council and voters, but it's not as clear and obvious to either me or the lawyers at this point, but we're looking into it and we'll get clear in that process. So at least we know exactly what all of our options are and what each of them would entail. So, that's the full gamut of what we've got to consider.
Can I add to that last piece? I think that, yep. I know that this goes without saying for the board, but, we should be very cautious about going down that road, because those reserves are probably going to be very necessary in the next year or two, as the economy continues to suffer as a result of this. And so, I think we should be very, very conservative on that. So the reason that we're putting this in front of you again today is just to remind you that we are going to be facing some really difficult decisions, starting likely in November, December, and then probably continuing for the next several years, that will require us to do some things that we don't want to do. So, but we just wanted to also put out there that these are the options, in addition to obviously cutting things. It's to tap into balances and reserves.
I also just, in closing, wanted to note a couple of things. So first of all, it's very hard to know where you are until the year starts, right? So there's actually a fair amount of vacancies right now, even on local. So we might find ourselves, once we actually get in and we've got a bi-weekly payroll amount I can project forward, we may have a fair amount of start of the year vacancy savings. That might be higher than you might think. Those things add up if we have vacancies. Also, I just want to point out that 55 FTEs almost, and these are all new hires. By and large, the vast majority are new hires. The margin of error in my estimates is huge. I mean, the difference between an adult child benefits selection and a single selection is $7,000. And so even a $5,000 margin of error on 50 positions, I mean, it's absolutely huge. Statistically, it's highly unlikely that it's going to go in one way or the other. It usually comes out to the averages that I'm using in my estimates. That's why they're my averages. But, you know, it is possible that because these are a lot of late hires, we might be getting pools with much younger, less experienced teachers. We might come in lower. I've used my kind of generic teacher salary estimate. But these, I guess my point is, you know, these estimates need to play out. It could be better, it could be slightly worse. I'm hoping it's better. But I just want to be clear that, you know, these are 55 people we don't have, you know, we don't know what their salaries are, their benefit selections are yet. So that all has to play out. And then, you know, these numbers will get much, much, much sharper as we move into the fall.
Let's see, Tim and then Emily.
Yeah, I just wanted to know how I should think about, you were comparing, Miranda, the 1.45 that you've identified here against it was a 2.1 million. I think that was just in the staffing costs, but on the previous slide, there was some additional costs added there that added up to 4 something. I didn't write it down, but yeah, so 4.2 is that the gap that I should be thinking about, or is it the gap between the 2 and the 1.45? I'm just wondering, should I be more worried than I am when I see, you know, I mean, $600,000 is still a lot of money, but it's not 2.6.
I mean, I can give you my opinion on that. I don't know, Javier, if you want to jump in, but you know, the FTEs are the ones that we have, you know, 90-day notice to give. It's the bigger commitment that we've made. So to me, when I'm thinking about it, that's the number that I'm initially thinking about. I have personally assumed that this second slide, you know, is slightly less of a priority, but that's not necessarily my place to say. So to the extent that these are going to continue and we feel it's absolutely critical that they continue, then the $4 million is the one that we need to be worried about. Just from my perspective, having hired FTEs, that's where my mind goes first and foremost. And so that's kind of why I keep referencing that back, but it's a good point. I shouldn't do that. I don't know, Javier, what you have to say about that.
I generally agree with that. I think that, you know, we look at these as, you know, probably in this, you know, situation, the ones that, the one that we would, you know, probably more readily eliminate. And then, you know, we'd still have to look at reductions on the other side. And, you know, we would obviously have to be more, you know, specific about which positions and why and all of that kind of stuff. But, you know, I do think that Miranda's point is, you know, that one is that we have 90 days of, you know, 90 days is half of our school year, you know, so half of those salaries are committed, you know, if we don't make the decision until December 15th.
Thank you.
Emily?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to see if, you know, not urgent, but for an upcoming meeting, if, again, not urgent, like let's get through this initial period, but at an upcoming meeting, you know, even if it's a month or 6 weeks from now or what have you, could you do an update for us, Miranda, on our fund balance and reserves, so we have a better sense of what those look like, and maybe some of the kind of recent history?
You mean like over time? I mean, I can tell you what the balances are. I mean, it'll be easier. You know, I could give you something more comprehensive and that's clearer, but just to be clear what you're asking, do you mean over time, like in the past, or just what the balances are today?
Yeah, I think what the balances are today, what, you know, what we've maintained over time, and then, you know, if you can give us some guideposts for what you think, you know, we ideally would maintain moving forward, and what that means for, you know, this kind of last resort option.
Yeah.
Just so we have that broader, you know, we have that context and know if we need to go there, I personally, you know, I can better understand what the financial implications would be.
Yep, absolutely. Are there any other hands raised at this point? All right, so this is the last slide on this topic, and then we sort of shift gears. So if nobody has anything else, I will move it along. And I think, Javier, are you taking over?
Yep.
Okay.
So in somewhat of a continuation, but not a complete linear one, I just wanted to tee up the elementary reconfiguration. I know in the past month, as I've been meeting one-on-one with board members, that I've raised this as an issue. Because we obviously are at a certain, we were at a certain place in talking about elementary reconfiguration, and we need to sort of just come back to it. And I wanted to take the opportunity to do that. I'm sorry. So I just wanted to tee it back up for the Finance Committee. I think that as I talked to people, that's the place where we decided that it made the most sense to tee that up. So we're gonna, just a little bit of recall. I think everybody remembers this. It was one of the possible options that we discussed in the enrollment and facility study. So that's where the elementary reconfiguration idea came from. Next slide. When we presented it back in March, you may remember, this is actually a slide from that March 10th presentation, that we were looking at it as about $1 million in savings that we would realize from doing that. So give me a second. I need to turn this off because it's so distracting. So the $1 million in savings comes primarily by reducing the number of teachers that we need. And we achieve this, I think, as Mr. Atkinson mentioned earlier, by just being more efficient. In this particular case, it allows us to run our classrooms closer to our maximum capacity per classroom, and that's where we realize the savings. So there were there were some downsides that included the loss of CP in a couple of schools, as well as some savings, and that we could bring pre-K into our schools, and so that brought with it some savings. That number, sorry, Miranda, I'll just wait for my next slide, please. So the savings here also reflects, I just want to remind you that this also reflected an increase in our class size in grades 1 and 2. So, we kept kindergarten where it was, but we upped the class size in grades 1 and 2. So this was not just a straight efficiency, it was also an efficiency that went with the class size. I think without the class size, the savings were somewhere in the neighborhood of 700,000 or something to that. I don't know if you remember, Miranda, off the top of your head.
I don't remember. We have some slides in the appendix. Maybe we can check out after and see if it reminds us.
Yeah.
And it was grades 1 through 3, right? I think that we increased the class size from 22 to 25. It's 4 and 5 or 25 right now, I think, right? Is that?
It's 1, 2, and 3. That's right.
1, 2, 3. Okay.
I always get mixed up because my old district, 3 was also the same as 4 and 5. So
yeah. Next slide.
Next slide, please. So this was the reconfiguration proposal as we brought it to you. You remember we had 2 different ways of doing this, but this was the one that that we eventually brought forward. And so this was the coupling of schools with, one school becoming a primary center, the other one becoming an intermediate center. So next slide, please. Just a summary of what were significantly more detailed pros and cons. On the plus side, there was the financial savings. And at the time that we talked about this, we were looking to redirect those savings to support some of our equity investments. So it was almost, one-to-one exchange. There wasn't a savings that resulted from it. It was primarily to support the implementation of our Allow plan and some of the curriculum improvements. In addition to that, we know that we get a more balanced and representative set of demographics for our schools. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Two schools on the peninsula really don't change at all. And, so that is, basically Reiki and East End do not change significantly. They switch out some, demographics in the different grade configurations, but there's no change there. And Longfellow and Ocean improve only slightly from their, sort of very clear identification as schools that are primarily white and non-free and reduced lunch. So again, it's not a perfect, but it's an approximation to the district, a slight approximation to the district. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, increases space for pre-kindergarten and school sites. And there are some programmatic advantages, but you also see on the other side that there are some programmatic concerns. So I think there's a balancing of those, depending on what you place your value in, that that sort of can offset each other. In addition to that sort of offset on the programmatic side, so on the advantage side, it's specialization and larger teams. So there's specialization within those teams, the ability to assign students to specific teachers more readily than we are able to do in a smaller. If you only have 2 teachers in grade 3, then you're going to get Mr. Watana, you're going to get Ms. Fasulo. That's end of the story. But if there's 5 of us in a school, then there's variation, and you can do some additional work around that. So that's what the larger teams is, as well as some of the mentoring and support for new teachers and things like that that would go with that. On the con side, from the programmatic perspective, there's a concern that the education, particularly in the intermediate centers, becomes more sort of content area centric and less less child centric. So it doesn't have to be that way, but people that have had experience with these types of configurations say that that's one of the things that you need to watch for. And then also concerned that because there's no testing happening in the lower grades, that people will think less about the sort of the need to prepare students for the standards-based assessments and so on. So in addition to that, very significant con was we're adding a transition into that. So where now our kids transition one side of elementary school, one side of middle school, they would now transition one side of primary school, one side of intermediate school, and then obviously out of middle school as well. And a disruption to the current status. So that has impacts on neighborhoods and where people identify with. The children that can walk to school, that will only be able to walk to school for one portion of their education. And obviously we have some school models in some of our elementary schools that would potentially be impacted. So we talked particularly about the Ocean Avenue configuration, where that was an area of concern. So that's the next slide, please. So just, where we left off, we tabled it because we were headed, into the COVID rapids. And so that was, we knew that that it was going to be a highly charged topic. It was embedded in the budget, and we just didn't feel that we could, that we could manage building the understanding and support for it as part of that. We talked about, sort of shifting it out of a budget discussion into one about that value proposition, about, why those investments that we currently can't afford would be worth giving up some of those things that we just talked about, and sort of engaging the community in a broader conversation around that. And there was just like it was not the time to be having that kind of a conversation in March of 2020. So that's where we left it. And so what I wanted to do, next slide, is talk a little bit about where we are today. Because our context is, slightly different, but, this still sits out there as something that we need to reconcile ourselves to. So the pressure on our capacity for engagement continues to be the same. So, I don't think today is any easier to bring people together into a conversation about, reconfiguring elementary schools when we've reconfigured elementary schools significantly, in the last 6 months, but, sort of thinking beyond COVID and thinking about what would it look like and all of that, is still just really difficult for me to envision bringing people together around this issue, not to mention the bandwidth that would be required to have that conversation. And, if you recall the enrollment and facility study, if you use that as a sort of a model for how to sort of engage people around those issues, was a super intensive effort that required a lot of board time, a lot of community time, a lot of staff time. So I think that that's, a major concern. And I also just, have to recognize that the budget pressures are there, right? And they're going to be more intense. We just had this conversation about, the next half of 2020, not looking ahead to FY22. And, in FY22, every forecast that we've received is that it's going to be, a more difficult budget than ever before. There is, less money at the state level. There is less capacity at the local level to absorb any increases in our budget. And so, the something like the elementary reconfiguration, trying to separate it from budget is almost, it just seems like it's impossible to separate it from budget. So, where we might have had a conversation about, we want to do all of these things and we can't raise that much, we can't raise the budget by that much. So if we do this and create create a gap, then we can fill, we can use that gap to do some of these equity investments. That seems much harder to think is a viable option. So, so what I just wanted to do today is tee that up with the Finance Committee to sort of get your thoughts about where we go with this topic. I don't want it to just never, come back, and, some closure around what's our next steps on this is what I'm looking for from the committee today. So we might start with, any clarifying questions, and then I think a little bit of, sort of brainstorming, temperature checking on what your thoughts are on, our current reality and elementary reconfiguration and where we go from here.
I'm waiting for hands. I don't see any at the moment. Tim.
Hey, well, so first of all, this is this is a very difficult topic to ponder, and I appreciate the way that you framed it, Javier. I guess my biggest concern, I think, is with the staff capacity, and just you know, to do something like the enrollment and facilities study scale of engagement in this year when you know, standing up a pandemic school year and maintaining that and iterating on it throughout the year. I just I think that's the biggest concern that I have currently. You know, I often worry about how much we ask of our staff, and I'm particularly concerned about that in this year, just, you know, without even piling on this additional significant work. So I guess that's the first thing that that really, you know, concerns me. But I guess you know, you've got to weigh that against the reality of the budget situation that's going to be coming. So I don't think there's any answer or guidance in there, but it's very difficult, and yeah, I think that's all I really have to say at the moment.
Emily.
Sorry. I guess, you know, I have a lot of feelings about this. I guess first off, you know, my perspective is when we're in a position to make hard decisions in order to prioritize equity, I think that we need to do that, and I'm ready to make those hard decisions. You know, now we're reconfiguration. You know, I was skeptical when this initially came up, and remain skeptical that you know, that when you weigh the pros and cons, that this is actually a good, you know, if we were so. You know, we're not in the position now that we can make those equity investments. Yes, I absolutely want to see all those investments in the LAO plan that reconfiguration would have supported. I do worry about some of the implications of reconfiguration on other elements of, you know, enabling marginalized students to succeed and to give them that education that they deserve. I guess I have a few questions. One is, you know, could we look at the cost implications of increasing class size only in our schools that don't that are not high poverty schools? Sorry for the double negative. Mm-hmm. So in our high poverty schools, could we keep, what would be the cost implications of keeping class size as it is? Because I think there are particular challenges around increasing class size in our high poverty schools. And just as a reminder to my colleagues, you know, there are, this proposal makes some progress at redistributing our population, but it's not, you know, it's almost around the edges. It's not that significant. I don't mean to minimize it, but we still have high poverty schools. I've talked with the superintendent about, you know, if really our endpoint is around equity, I would prefer to do like a pretty significant redistricting. I know that that's, but clearly that doesn't put us in the in the situation of actually saving money.
You could do redistricting with reconfiguration. I mean, it would be more of a sea change, because some people would be going from, instead of going to primary at Rowe and intermediate at Longfellow, they might go from primary at Rowe. They might go from primary at Talbot and intermediate at Lyseth.
Yeah.
So, it will change not just the what grades you go to what school, but it might just change the schools you go to altogether.
That seems like what reconfiguration already is very disruptive, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't disrupt the status quo, because our we know our schools aren't working for a good number of kids, right? But the disruption on top of disruption, I think, is not very attractive to me. So I'm just saying, like, if really we want to solve the problem of our schools are demographically not equal, and that has ramifications on our ability to provide an equitable education, I think that redistricting is the better way. But clearly we're also in a situation where we have structural financial challenges. So I just wanted to state that, because I guess when I look at reconfiguration, I see a completely different solution in order to address like one of what we're saying is the drivers for, or I guess one of just the pros that we identify. I think there's a more direct way to get to that outcome that would actually could have more meaningful results. And then on the process issues, it just seems very hard to engage the community in a meaningful way in this time. So I appreciate bringing it up in this before this committee, and having it out on the table as something that given the immense budget challenges that we might face if the feds don't come through and the state doesn't come through with more money in the middle of a pandemic, then yeah, I think that we're going to have to make a lot of hard choices. So I do think that within this proposal, if we can look at, again, coming back to my initial point, what if we only increase class size at some schools, and how much of an impact would we still be able to, how much money would we still be able to save? I think that for me, that could be, that would be really helpful to see that.
And it will, I mean, I've got it, and I think that makes, complete sense, and we will do that. I do just want to point out that I'm struggling just even thinking about how we would do that with our current configuration of students. So, we can easily model it on like last year, what it would have been if we had just done that versus, with this year's configuration, obviously.
Okay, I see Mark and then Roberto.
Yeah, so I just wanted to comment on the engagement piece. And I know Tim mentioned the impact it would have on staff. So, I agree with that. Just want to take a look at it from the parent side, as parents, begin the school year, we haven't even started, and, it's already trying to figure out what we're going to do, what routines are going to be like, and then to throw this in as well. With that being said, I understand that the idea is that reconfiguration would be implemented next year, right? And so you have to start engagement as soon as possible, I think, if you want to have it meaningful. And if you're working on a timeline of next year, you'd have to start as soon as possible. That's my thought. I don't know how constructive it would be in the short term right now, but that's what I'm thinking.
I mean, I guess just my follow-up to that is, would you envision it being something akin to what we did with the elementary, with the enrollment and facility study, with a set of, I mean, board, would have to decide, board would appoint a commission. We would meet a number of times over the course of the year and then come back with a recommendation. And along the way have, feedback loops with the community. Or could you envision a more abbreviated process that would just basically be, sort of as part of the budget process, explaining to people why we're doing this?
Yeah, I would envision a more thorough process. The first one you described, the first option you described. I think if we include in the finance committee and the budget process, I don't see enough engagement. I think there's going to be huge backlash as is, but then without the engagement, I don't know how people are going to react. I don't know.
Roberto, and then Tim.
Can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I guess it'll be good also, Javier, for you to tell us a little bit about what you think your bandwidth is for implementing reconfiguration within that, for next year, considering that the school year that we're in is literally the scenario for which we pulled this off the rack last year. And then on the other piece, I'm actually not, the idea of redistricting on top of, or rather as a precursor, I guess on top of reconfiguration, to me does not, I appreciate what Emily said about it's kind of like more disruption. I actually see, normally the reconfiguration conversation is difficult because people know, quote unquote, what they're losing, versus this on the other side of redistricting. People know what they're losing. So on the other side of redistricting here, you're gonna already be reconfiguring. So you're gonna come out, everyone's gonna come out with something different, which I think is one of the pros of it, that it's across the district. Versus if you only did redistricting, it tends to be more like certain pockets get hit more than others. So to me, doing it together, it's hard. Obviously, it's hard for me to explain it, but it's almost complementary to some degree. Javier, the last question, I guess, is can you talk about what would be the cost of getting the redistricting information, or what would get us to be able to make a decision for that, and what the process would look like for that?
So on the first one, in terms of the bandwidth, there's not a lot of bandwidth to do any of this. So that's the reality of it. So it would be, a huge undertaking, no matter how you look at it. So, I think that it's a challenge no matter how you look at it. The costs with something like this would probably not be that high. I mean, I think if you think back, and I've, when I redistricted before, we had the capacity in-house to be able to manipulate maps and things along those lines that we don't currently have. So this would be relatively small. I would guess 30 to 35, to not to top $50,000. And that's, I think, I'm pretty confident in that.
Thanks. So I think I'm with Roberto, that if redistricting is something that we are considering and think is a good piece of this. I think it makes sense to do it all in one move rather than, you know, I don't think it would be ideal to do a reconfiguration in 1 year and then 3 years later redistrict. That seems even worse to me. The other the other thing I wanted to bring up is just the equity investments and the allow plan investments. You know, a year ago or maybe even more recently, we were talking about this as our legal and moral obligation. And I just I don't know. I'm having a hard time coming to terms with the way that the conversation tonight has just sort of I don't know, sort of throwing up our hands at that, and nobody here wants to be in that position, and you know, we're in a pandemic and none of this is ideal, but I'm wondering how we start to get to a place where we can make those investments, because that's it's really critical to help students, you know, have the tools that they need to access the education that we're providing. So I don't know that there's an answer to that, but it's heavy. Anna, you're muted.
There we go. My computer just gave me a message. Just a couple thoughts. I guess to me, the process would maybe be dependent upon kind of, you know, the district's timeline for a recommendation. So, you know, is this, first of all, still a recommendation of the district? And when is sort of the ideal drop dead date, if so? And, you know, if it's next year, you know, I think we've got to figure out a process pretty quickly. I'm not afraid of having it in the context of a budget discussion, because it's very hard to separate from a budget discussion, and we're periodically in budget season. Budget season never ends, so it always is a budget discussion anyway. But I also understand that you know, a major concern last time was around community engagement and so forth. And so if you know, we feel the need to kind of meet that that requirement, then I think you know, an extended process is probably a good idea. My other thought was just, I'm a little concerned about starting the conversation before the election, only because we're having a third of the board turnover, and I would hate to put the school board candidates in a position where they're having to kind of take a position on this issue before they even get on the board and become informed about it. So that's just a consideration. I'm a little less concerned about disruption, only because right now we're in the middle of total disruption. So it's kind of, I don't know, I feel like what's a little more distant? Well, you know, we've shown that we can kind of handle it, but so I don't know. I think the question of bandwidth on staff is a concern, but it also is dependent again on you know, how much of a recommendation really is this from staff, and what's the timeline for your preference in implementing it. I think that's all I have right now.
I mean, I appreciate I think, you know, what resonated is that no matter what you do, this is a budget discussion. And so you know, the decoupling, it's not decoupling it from the budget and the issue, which I think is what Mr. Balfons was also, saying. The issue really is the extent to which you're engaging people around the why around it, which is where the bandwidth issue comes into play. So I appreciate that, and I think that's an important distinction to sort of a framing for this. I guess from my standpoint, and maybe this is why I've got this, sort of keeps churning in my head. It's like, I know, or I don't know, but I suspect that we are going to be in a very challenging budget environment as we go into this next year. So I don't think there is a way that we can avoid having this conversation in the context of the budget. So, whether we do the engagement or not, this will need to come up as one of the possible options, of what will likely be many other unsatisfactory that we need to talk about. And so maybe that's why I keep sort of bringing this back, is just knowing that this is one that we have, that we've done, like I can have this conversation with this board. And I think your point about the fact that it will be a significantly different board, when we actually have this conversation. But, I can have this conversation with the board and you guys know what I'm talking about. And, many of the other issues that we're gonna, come up with are going to be just as disruptive, just as, galvanizing and, difficult for people in the community to deal with. And we will not have had the amount of vetting that we've had, or the amount of data and different, sort of discussions about it. So I think that's in some ways why I keep gravitating to this, because I would love to not have to have this conversation in the context of a budget, but I don't see any way that we can avoid having this conversation in the context of that FY22 budget.
Emily?
Yeah, I mean, this is the comment I say at every meeting, which in some ways, has borne out, but, it's a fluid political situation, and I remain optimist that that there are opportunities that will help us, like they're helping us be in a position to reopen schools now. Every school to some extent, every school in Maine is going to have some aspect of, of being in a total financial crunch, as well as, most schools around the nation. So I encourage us to, I know that's not enough, that we have to do planning for the situation, the resources that we have now, and that we expect to, that we have certainty to expect. But I do, also look on the positive side of knowing that this is a really unique situation, and that schools all across the state and country are going to be to some extent facing, some degree of complete financial hardship. And yeah, just wanted to put that context out there.
I feel like we haven't given you a very strong guidance on process around this. I'm not sure we have the best answer at the moment.
I mean, I'm sorry, I'm eating, guys. That's why I keep turning mine. I was cooking and now eating. So I think what Javier said a moment ago is maybe it helps me think about the engagement piece, in that, yes, we recognize that was the biggest takeaway from last year, from when this conversation first came out, that the engagement was not satisfactory to a lot of community members. But if this is just inevitably going to be one of our options during the budget, then how much strain do we want to put on staff for that engagement? And is the enrollment and facility study really the benchmark of that? Because I mean, even to that process, there were people at the end that felt like they weren't included, or that they didn't feel like they knew what was going on. And today here we are talking about that as the benchmark. So I appreciate us making a strong effort and being purposeful about it, but let's not pretend that we've mastered the art of public engagement for these processes, and that whatever we do is going to be satisfactory for any cohort of people across the board. So I don't know if that helps as guidance, but those were my thoughts.
Yeah, and I'll say, and I didn't expect like a straight line. Do this, it's not on as an action item. I guess some question is it worth bringing this to the full board as a workshop? I think that's one of the things that in some of my discussions with some of you and with other board members, where we've sort of batted this around, I settled on putting it onto the finance committee based on some of those conversations. But we also talked about, this is ultimately the full board needs to be engaged around this, that it's not a finance committee discussion, that then people can say like, well, I wasn't a part of the finance committee, and so I didn't know that we were doing this. So what are your thoughts on that very specifically?
Emily, did you have an answer to that?
Mm-hmm. I guess it feels to me a little premature. And then I'd also just second Anna's good point about the shifting board composition. But I do think in the next month, we could have a clearer picture of whether there will be additional federal resources. And unless Javier, you think, there's really, like, you would get that work underway, the planning work underway, you need the time there is bandwidth to get that planning underway right now, and you would need to get it started right now. So there's a real imperative to bring this to the full board right now. I think I would prefer to wait until we have a clearer picture of what our financial situation might be, and we have more of the board members who will eventually make the decision able to participate in the process.
Mark?
Yeah, I would support a workshop to the full board, informational, right? No action is being taken by this board at this point. And so just getting the information out there. And then as far as the process, however you pose the question, should it be more like the budget, or should it be more like, the facility study, and so it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other, right? I think with the budget, if we stick to kind of the budget process, I don't think that's enough engagement. But I think you do, points raised about issues with the facility study engagement, and maybe that wasn't the best way. And so maybe there's somewhere in the middle where it's kind of like a budget process plussed up, with more engagement. But I think engagement is going to be key. Obviously you know that. And so I don't think we should just keep to the traditional budget process.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the part that worries me about the engagement is I don't know what, like when we last talked about this as an engagement issue, we were really talking about, helping people to understand what you gained in exchange for what you lost, and come to value what you gained as worth the sacrifice. My biggest concern is that I don't feel like we're in a position, and I know this is, I hear Tim on this, and I, share that disappointment, and I hear Emily, and, I am going to go light a candle to, St. Jude, hoping for just that. But, it's not, I'm not real certain that we're in a position to have a conversation about what's the value proposition here as something that is like a sacrifice for a higher gain. And that's what concerns me the most, is engaging people to basically say, like, we need to cut a bunch of money from the budget, and this is one of the ways that we're thinking about cutting it. That's where it feels to me like this is really, like, now is more of a budget conversation than it is a values conversation, which is, I think, what we heard at the time that we were advancing this is like, why are you putting this into the budget if what you're really talking about is your equity thing? I might be able to get to that place if you if you explained it to me and you gave me a chance to sit with it, which I think actually is what happened with some of you, on the board, that along the way you came to value what we would get as important enough that you were willing to sacrifice what you would lose. And and I don't mean you individually, but you as representatives of the community. And I just am concerned that we're not in a place where we're going to ever, I don't want to say ever, my candle is still going to be there, but that this go around, we're going to be talking about this as a budget savings, not as an exchange for the LAO plan.
Emily?
I do want to just bring us back to the fact that so many in our community have suffered significant trauma, are still experiencing significant trauma as a result of the pandemic. And putting this out there as a potential, yes, school has been disrupted, our lives have been disrupted, but people are still holding on to what they know, right? And for some people, they know their community school. They're still holding on to that neighborhood school. And I worry that we really, especially if this is put out there as I worry that we burn people's trust, and that we decide that this is the right thing to do from an equity perspective later on, that we were not able to do it because we get people so up in arms. And then I think lastly, I just worry, like, I would expect a very significant public backlash. And I worry about the capacity to respond to the community and take that on top of everything else that's happening right now.
I think those are good points.
Yeah, as to the question of whether or not to bring it to the board at this point, I think I agree with Emily that it feels a little bit premature. If it's a conversation that the finance committee is going to be having during budget season, then I think it does need to go to the board, for the sake of transparency, like you mentioned, Javier, so that there's no secret that these are conversations that are happening in the finance committee, and that the board is kind of kept along throughout the process. But I do think that it just, at this point, I don't know, I think it's maybe a month or two premature, because we don't, we still have moving pieces financially, and it's ahead of the election. So yeah, and I mean, again, I personally am fine with having it be a budget conversation. I just, I don't know how much the community sort of needs, you know, just because it was an area of criticism, you know, is it due diligence, I guess, to have a more robust process. And I guess the other thing is the question of, you know, what we're getting in exchange for making this. I think that the board is going to struggle with that as much as the community would. So that's that, you know, if we're not able to point to the value proposition, and it's all about just, you know, saving money, that's not something that the board is going to necessarily be better equipped to have a conversation about than the full community. So that's just a thought to put out there. Tim?
I guess the distinction I would put out there as between the board and the community is, you know, we're gonna be in the hot seat come budget season. I guess I don't know. I probably shouldn't include myself in that, but the board is going to be in the hot seat in come budget season, and have to make a difficult decision. And you know, this opportunity for a budget reduction is probably going to be weighed against, you know, is going to have to be weighed against other opportunities to trim the budget that are probably, you know, in some cases much less popular things. But the other side of that, I guess, is what Emily was bringing up, and I don't think we want to bring out like our list of all the other things, other ways in which we could change the district that are not popular at this time when folks are just sort of reacclimatizing to the new the different type of school that we're providing this year. So yeah, I think that's all I've got at this.
So does anybody, so I guess what I'm walking away with is that we should probably not bring this to the board at this time. I think that, you know, the general sense is a workshop at some point would probably make sense, but it probably would be best to wait for a new board to be in place and to sort of tee it up with that board. And I would say, I'm not sure that you all said this, but I'm sort of walking away with the idea that this is, you know, something that would probably be included in, I think this is what Tim just said, it would probably be included in a budget conversation, not as a sort of a standalone, that it would actually be a part of next year's budget conversation if we are in a situation to need to make significant cuts. I mean, I think, you know, from my perspective, if we weren't in that situation, if, you know, the candle does its work and we get additional money and things along those lines, then, you know, this would not be something for us to bring to the budget conversation for next year. However, if we are in a situation where we're having significant reductions, this will naturally be a part of that conversation, and that's probably the place to leave it. And so maybe wait until the new board is seated, until we're, you know, have a better picture of, you know, the financial situation, as Emily mentioned, And then, you know, if this is warranted, then bring it up in that context.
I think that makes sense.
All right. Well, I appreciate your partnership in thinking through this. I really do. That was the whole purpose of putting it on the agenda with the Finance Committee, was to sort of try to think it through with a significant number of board members in a way that's helpful for us to sort of frame for them for the where do we go from here.
Well, we appreciate you bringing it up, and we're happy to talk about whatever you want. And I also just wanted to say, with the earlier presentation on the finances, I really appreciate the work that has gone into this, and I recognize the just utter chaos right now and the long hours that everybody's putting in, and I think we all just want to reiterate how impressed we are with your work and how much we appreciate you being there.
Thanks. Miranda's the one doing all the work, though. So
Yeah, I know.
So.
Okay, so unless anybody has any last thoughts, I guess I'll call for a motion to adjourn. Mark, seconded by Emily. All those in favor? It's unanimous, and we're adjourned.
Great, thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.